August 14th, 1887. That was the night the town of Silver Creek locked their doors and loaded their Winchesters. Not because of outlaws, not because of wolves, but because 500 Navajo warriors had surrounded a single, lonely cabin at the edge of the Badlands. The townsfolk thought it was a siege. They thought it was a massacre waiting to happen, but they were wrong. They didn't hear war cries that night. They heard a song so powerful it shook the dust off the rafters. This is the true, untold story of Hannah Vance, the frontier girl who plunged into a wall of water to save a life, and how that single act of courage turned a quiet valley into a war zone. The Arizona Territory didn't forgive weakness. It baked it out of you, leaving only gristle and bone. Hannah Vance knew this better than anyone. At 19, she was the sole owner of the Vance homestead, 40 acres of scrub brush, red dust, and a dried-up creek bed that the locals called Devil's Throat. Since her father, Elias Vance, had passed from consumption the winter before, the vultures had started circling. The biggest vulture of them all was Jedediah Holt. Holt owned the Double Bar H, the massive cattle ranch that swallowed up everything north of Silver Creek. He was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. Heavy silver spurs, a clean white Stetson that never seemed to catch the dust, and a smile that didn't reach his cold gray eyes. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the heat shimmering in waves off the hard-packed earth, when Holt rode up to Hannah's porch. He didn't come alone. He brought his foreman, a man named Silas Pike, whose reputation for violence was known all the way to Tucson. Hannah was on the porch, cleaning her father's old Henry rifle. She didn't set it down when they rode up. "Afternoon, Miss Vance," Holt called out, leaning casually on his saddle horn. "Hot one today?" "It's hot every day, Mr. Holt," Hannah said, her voice flat. "State your business. I've got fence to mend." Holt chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Always so prickly. I like that about you, Hannah. Reminds me of your daddy. Stubborn old mule he was." "My father was a good man," Hannah snapped, her fingers tightening on the rifle stock. "Which is more than folks say about you." Holt's smile vanished. "I'm here to make you a final offer, girl. The drought's killing off the small fry. You've got no water rights that matter, and your well is going to run dry before October. Sell to me. I'll give you $50 and a stagecoach ticket to St. Louis. You can find a husband. Live a lady's life." "I'm not leaving," Hannah said. "This is Vance land. The deed is in the lockbox, and the taxes are paid." Silas Pike shifted his horse forward, the leather creaking ominously. "Taxes don't keep you safe, little girl. Accidents happen out here. Fires start. Livestock wanders off." "Is that a threat, Pike?" Hannah stood up, leveling the rifle at the foreman's chest. She didn't tremble. She couldn't afford to. Holt raised a hand, stopping his man. Now. No need for unpleasantness. You think about it, Hannah. But don't take too long. The rains are coming. And when the storms hit the high country, things get washed away." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode off, Pike trailing behind him like a shadow. Hannah watched them go, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew Holt wasn't talking about the weather. He wanted the water access in the canyon behind her cabin. It was the only path through the ridge to the Sweetwater River. But Holt was right about one thing. The rains were coming. The sky to the north, over the jagged peaks of the Vermilion Cliffs, was turning a bruised purple. The air felt heavy, charged with static electricity. The horses in the corral were pacing nervously, ears pinned back. Hannah went inside and checked her supplies. A half sack of flour, some dried venison, and a tin of coffee. She was poor, she was alone, and she was being hunted by the most powerful man in the county. But she wasn't afraid of the men. She should have been afraid of the sky. In the Arizona high desert, rain doesn't fall. It crashes. And when it hits the sun-baked earth, the ground is too hard to drink it. The water simply runs, gathering speed, gathering rage, until it finds a channel. And Hannah's cabin sat right next to the biggest channel for miles. 2 hours later, the silence of the desert was broken. It wasn't thunder. Thunder rolls. This was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. Hannah paused in the middle of chopping wood. She felt the vibration through the soles of her boots, the wash. She dropped the axe and ran toward the edge of the canyon. The Devil's Throat was usually a dry, sandy bed about 20 feet deep and 50 feet across. But now the smell of wet sagebrush and ozone hit her hard. Then she heard it. A roar like a freight train. "Get to high ground," she screamed, though there was no one to hear her but the horses. She ran back to the corral and threw the gate open, slapping the mare on the flank to send her scrambling up the ridge. She turned back to the canyon edge, mesmerized by the terrifying power of nature. It came around the bend like a living thing, a wall of brown, churning water, 10 feet high, carrying uprooted trees, boulders, and dead cattle. It smashed against the canyon walls, spraying mud and foam 50 feet into the air. Hannah watched, awestruck, ready to turn back to the safety of her cabin when she saw a flash of color. Red. Bright, unnatural red against the brown sludge. She squinted against the wind. There, clinging desperately to the trunk of a dead mesquite tree that was bobbing in the violent current, was a small figure. A child. He was wearing a red tunic. He was small, maybe 7 or 8 years old. His dark hair was plastered to his skull, and his mouth was open in a silent scream, drowned out by the roar of the flood. "No," Hannah whispered. "Oh God, no." Most people in Silver Creek would have turned away. They would have said it was God's will. They would have seen the dark skin and the tunic and known the boy was Navajo, Diné. To the townsfolk, the Navajo were the enemy. They were savages who stole sheep and threatened the settlements. But Hannah didn't see an enemy. She saw a terrified boy about to die. She didn't think. Instinct took the reins. She grabbed the coil of hemp rope hanging from the fence post. She sprinted along the rim of the canyon, racing the water. The mesquite tree was spinning, caught in a vortex, smashing against the rocks. The boy was slipping. Hannah spotted a narrow outcropping of rock that jutted out over the floodwater about 50 yards downstream. If she could get there before the tree did. She ran, her lungs burning, her boots slipping on the wet shale. She hit the rock, dropped to her knees, and quickly tied one end of the rope around a jagged boulder. She tied the other end around her waist. There was no time to be careful. She leaped off the edge. The rope snapped taut, jerking the wind out of her, slamming her into the side of the canyon wall. She gasped, pain shooting through her ribs, and lowered herself down toward the churning hell below. She hung there, 5 feet above the water, swinging wildly. "Grab my hand," she screamed, extending her arm. The mesquite tree came rushing toward her. The boy saw her. His eyes were wide, dark pools of terror. He was frozen. "Jump!" Hannah shrieked. "You have to jump!" The tree hit a submerged rock and buckled. The boy was thrown loose into the current. Hannah lunged. She threw her body outward, straining the rope to its breaking point. Her hand closed around the wet fabric of the boy's tunic. The force of the water yanked her downward, submerging her. For a second, there was only darkness, the roar of the water, and the crushing weight of the debris. She kicked, struggling for air, her grip on the boy's shirt tightening like a vice. She broke the surface, gasping, spitting mud. She had him. She had him by the arm. "Hold on," she choked out. She began to climb the rope, hand over hand, with the boy clinging to her neck. Every muscle in her body screamed. The water snapped at her boots, trying to drag them back down. She hauled them both up the side of the slick rock face, scraping her knees raw, until they collapsed onto the ledge, safe above the flood line. For a long time, neither of them moved. They just lay there in the mud, chests heaving, the roar of the water passing below them. Finally, Hannah sat up and wiped the mud from her eyes. She looked at the boy. He was shivering violently. He looked up at her, his eyes scanning her face. He didn't cry. He just watched her with an intensity that made Hannah shiver. Around his neck, revealed by the torn tunic, was a necklace, a heavy piece of turquoise carved in the shape of a raven set in silver. Hannah's breath hitched. She knew enough about the local tribes to know that wasn't just jewelry. That was a symbol of rank. "You're not just any boy, are you?" she whispered. The boy said nothing. But then he pointed toward the north, back up the canyon. Hannah looked. Standing on the opposite ridge, silhouetted against the storm clouds, was a rider. He wasn't Navajo. He was wearing a long duster coat and a white hat. It was one of Holt's men. He was watching them, and he had a rifle across his saddle. A cold realization washed over Hannah, colder than the floodwater. The boy hadn't just fallen in. He had been chased. She grabbed the boy and pulled him to his feet. "Run," she said. "We have to get to the cabin. Now." Hannah didn't look back. She grabbed the boy's hand, her grip like iron, and dragged him up the goat path toward the back of her cabin. The mud sucked at their boots, and the wind whipped Hannah's wet skirts around her legs, but she didn't slow down. She knew the man on the ridge, the one in the duster coat, was Silas Pike, and she knew that if Pike was watching a Navajo child drown without lifting a finger, it wasn't an accident. It was an execution. They burst through the back door of the cabin. Hannah slammed the heavy oak door shut and dropped the crossbar into place. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was cold and clear. "Get under the table," she ordered the boy. He didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, dripping water onto the rough-hewn floorboards, shivering so hard his teeth chattered. He looked small, frail, and utterly out of place among her jars of preserves and faded quilts. Hannah grabbed a wool blanket from her cot and wrapped it around him. She knelt, rubbing his arms vigorously to get the blood moving. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice softening. "But there are men out there who will. Do you understand?" The boy looked at the door, then back at her. He touched the turquoise raven at his throat. Then for the first time, he spoke. His English was broken, accented, but clear. "They chased," he whispered. "The white hats. They chased the sheep. Then they chased me." Hannah's stomach churned. The white hats. That was what the locals called Holt's hired guns because of the pristine Stetsons they wore, a symbol of their arrogance. Holt wasn't just waiting for the drought to kill off the small ranchers. He was actively provoking the Navajo. If he killed a high-ranking child, the tribe would retaliate. They would burn the valley. And in the chaos, Holt would bring in the cavalry, to wipe them out and claim the land for pennies. It was a land grab written in blood. "What is your name?" Hana asked. "Ashki," he said. It simply meant boy in his tongue, she knew. He wasn't trusting her with his true name yet. "All right, Ashki, stay down." Hana moved to the window, keeping her body to the side of the frame. She peered out through the crack in the shutters. The rain had stopped, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the yard. 3 riders were coming up the main road, not galloping, walking their horses slowly. In the lead was Jedediah Holt. On his right was Silas Pike. On his left was a man Hana didn't know, a hired gun with a scarred face and a sawed-off shotgun holstered on his saddle. They stopped at the gate, 50 yards out. "Miss Vance!" Holt's voice boomed, smooth and polite as a preacher's. "We saw you down by the wash. Looks like you found something that belongs to the reservation. We're here to help you return it." Hana grabbed her father's Henry rifle. She checked the chamber. Loaded. She shoved a handful of extra cartridges into her apron pocket. She cracked the front door open just an inch, aiming the barrel through the gap. "I don't need your help, Holt," she shouted. "The boy is safe. I'll take him to the agent at Fort Defiance myself in the morning." Holt laughed. "Now, Hana, be reasonable. Fort Defiance is 2 days' ride. You can't travel with a savage. It ain't proper, and it ain't safe. Pike here will take the boy off your hands. We'll make sure he gets home. Like you made sure he got into the flood," Hana yelled back. The silence that followed was deafening. Holt's smile dropped. He exchanged a look with Pike. "You're making a mistake, girl," Holt said, his voice dropping an octave. "You're accusing a pillar of the community of attempted murder. That's a dangerous road." "Get off my land," Hana said, cocking the hammer of the rifle. The clack-clack echoed across the yard. Holt sighed, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Pike, go get the boy. If she raises that rifle, shoot the girl. Self-defense." Pike grinned, revealing yellow, tobacco-stained teeth. He slid off his horse, unholstering his Colt Peacemaker. He began to walk toward the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Don't do it, Pike," Hana warned. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But her hands were steady. Her father had taught her well. Breathe out. Squeeze. Don't pull. Pike kept coming. "Put it down, darling. You ain't got the grit." He stepped onto the first step of the porch. Hana shifted her aim. She didn't shoot him in the chest. She shot the wooden post right next to his ear. Bang! Splinters exploded into Pike's face. He yelped, stumbling back, clutching his cheek. Blood trickled between his fingers. "Next one goes between your eyes," Hana screamed. Pike scrambled back to his horse, cursing. Holt's face turned a shade of purple Hana had never seen before. "You stupid little witch," Holt roared. "You think you can hold us off? You're one girl in a wooden box." "I'm a Vance," she shouted, "and this is my property." Holt wheeled his horse around. "Fine. Have it your way. Boys, surround the house. Burn them out. If she comes out with a weapon, put her down. If the boy runs, kill him." He turned to the scarred man. "Ride to town. Tell Marshal Thorne that the Navajo have raided the Vance place. Tell him Hana is a hostage. Get a posse. We'll finish this tonight." Hana slammed the door and bolted it. She slid down to the floor, gasping for air. She had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory. Ashki was staring at her from under the table. His eyes were wide. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why you fight for me?" Hannah looked at the rifle in her hands, then at the boy. Because, she said, her voice trembling, nobody deserves to be fed to the wolves. Night fell like a shroud. It was a moonless night, heavy and suffocating. Inside the cabin, Hannah had extinguished the lantern to keep from making them targets. The only light came from the embers of the stove, casting a dull red glow on the floor. She had moved the heavy oak wardrobe in front of the window. She had overturned the heavy dining table to create a barricade facing the door. Outside, the psychological warfare had begun. Holt's men, there were at least 6 of them now, were circling the cabin. Every few minutes, a shot would ring out, shattering a window pane or thumping into the logs. They weren't trying to kill her yet. They were trying to terrify her. They wanted her to panic and run out the back. "Come out, Hannah." Pike's voice drifted from the darkness, slurred with whiskey. "Fire's coming. We got the kerosene. Just send the brat out, and you can keep your little shack." Hannah crouched behind the table, the rifle resting on her shoulder. Ashkey was huddled behind her, clutching the back of her dress. "Are you scared?" she whispered to him. "Yes," the boy admitted. "Me too." "My father will come," Ashkey said. He said it with absolute certainty. "Your father doesn't know where you are, Ashkey. The rain washed away your tracks." "He will know," the boy insisted. "He is a Hatawi, a singer. He hears the wind." Hannah didn't have the heart to tell him that magic wouldn't stop a bullet. Suddenly, the smell of smoke drifted through the cracks in the floorboards. "They're lighting the porch," Hannah hissed. She scrambled to the back window, the only one not fully blocked. She peered out. Through the gloom, she saw a figure crouching by the corner of the house, piling dry brush against the logs. A match flared. Hannah didn't hesitate. She smashed the glass with the butt of her rifle, leveled the barrel, and fired. The figure screamed and fell back, clutching his shoulder. The brush didn't catch. "She's shooting! Rush her!" someone yelled. Bullets erupted from 3 sides. The wood of the cabin splintered and groaned. A slug punched through the door, missing Ashkey's head by inches and embedding itself in the stove. "Get down!" Hannah tackled the boy, covering his body with hers as glass and wood rained down on them. She fired back blindly, working the lever of the Henry rifle. Bang, click-clack, bang, click-clack. She had 12 rounds left. Then, from the distance, a new sound emerged. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the rumble of hooves, many hooves. "The posse," Hannah groaned. "Holt brought the marshal." If the marshal was here, maybe she could reason with him. Marshal Thorne was a hard man, but he wasn't a killer like Pike. "Marshal Thorne," she screamed into the darkness. "I'm not a hostage. Holt is lying. He's trying to kill this boy." "Shut up," Pike yelled from outside. "Don't listen to her, Marshal. She's gone mad. The Indian's got a knife to her throat." But the shooting stopped. The men outside seemed to be listening to the approaching riders. Hannah stood up cautiously, peering through the shattered front window. She expected to see the town posse, men with torches and badges. But as the clouds shifted, revealing a sliver of starlight, she saw the silhouette of the ridgeline. The riders weren't coming from the town. They were coming from the Badlands. They didn't carry torches. They sat on their horses in total stillness, lining the ridge like statues carved from obsidian. There were dozens of them, 50, maybe 100. The silence that fell over the valley was heavier than the floodwaters. Down in the yard, Pike and Holt's men froze. They saw them too. "Jesus," Pike whispered, his voice carrying in the stillness. "It's the whole damn tribe." The Navajo had arrived, But they didn't attack. They didn't scream war cries. They didn't charge. Instead, a single rhythm began. A low, rhythmic thumping. Thump, 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 thump. It was a drum. And then a voice rose. One deep baritone voice, chanting in a language as old as the canyons. Hey ya, hey ya, hey ya. Then another voice joined, and another, and another. Inside the cabin, Ashki stood up. The fear vanished from his face. He walked to the window and looked out at the ridge. My father, he said. He is singing the Hojhuji, the blessing way. Hana stared at the boy. They're praying? No, Ashki said, his eyes dark and fierce. They are not praying for peace. They are singing the death song for the evil spirits. Outside, the chanting grew louder, vibrating in Hana's chest. It wasn't a chaotic war cry. It was a wall of sound, disciplined and terrifying. It was the sound of a judgment coming down. Down in the yard, Holt's men were panicking. Their horses were rearing, spooked by the sound. Boss, we gotta go, one of the men shouted. There's too many of them. Stand your ground, Holt screamed. Though his voice cracked, they won't attack. They know the army will slaughter them if they cross that line. But the line of warriors on the ridge began to move. Slowly, like a landslide beginning to slide. They walked their horses down the slope, closing the circle. Hana realized with a jolt of terror that she and the boy were in the eye of the storm. Holt and his men were trapped between the cabin and the advancing Navajo. And then the sound of galloping horses came from the other direction, from the town road. Marshal Thorne had arrived with the posse. Now, 3 forces were converging on the tiny cabin in the dark. The corrupt rancher, the vengeful tribe, and the confused lawman. Hana looked at her last few bullets. She looked at Ashki. Stay close to me, she whispered. This is going to get loud. She walked to the door, unbolted it, and kicked it open. If she was going to die, she wasn't going to die hiding under a table. She stepped onto the porch, the rifle in her hand, the firelight from the stove framing her silhouette against the darkness. Stop, she screamed, her voice tearing through the night air. The chanting didn't stop. The drumming didn't stop. But the advancing line of warriors paused. From the darkness of the yard, Jedediah Holt raised his pistol at her. Get back inside, you fool. But before he could pull the trigger, an arrow whistled out of the dark. It struck Holt's pistol, shattering the wooden grip and sending the gun flying from his hand. Holt screamed, clutching his numb fingers. A massive war pony stepped into the light of the yard. On its back was a man with long gray braids, his face painted with black ash. He held a bow, but his eyes were fixed on the porch, on the boy. Ashki, the old man said softly. Father, the boy cried out, running past Hana. No. Hana lunged, grabbing the boy's tunic just as a gunshot rang out. Pike had fired. He wasn't aiming at the boy. He was aiming at the chief. But Hana had moved. The bullet meant for the chief struck the wooden post next to her, sending a shower of splinters into her face. She fell back, dragging the boy down with her. Chaos erupted. The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, rolling away like distant thunder. In the yard, time seemed to freeze. Silas Pike stood with his smoking pistol raised, a look of stunned stupidity on his face. He had meant to kill the chief. He had missed. On the porch, Hana lay in the dirt, covering Ashki's body with her own. She felt a stinging warmth on her cheek where the splinters had struck her, but she checked the boy frantically. Are you hit? Ashki, look at me. The boy shook his head, his eyes wide with shock. I am safe. Then the silence broke. It didn't break with a massacre. It broke with the sound of 50 bowstrings being drawn, taut simultaneously. It sounded like the intake of a giant breath. From the ridge, the Navajo warriors didn't scream. They simply leveled their arrows at the men in the yard. "Don't shoot!" Marshal Thorne roared, spurring his horse between the two groups. He was a big man, with a handlebar mustache and a reputation for fairness that was rare in the territory. He held his hands up, palms open. Nobody fires. The first man to pull a trigger hangs by morning. Jedediah Holt scrambled up from the dirt, cradling his smashed hand. "Marshal, thank God. These savages are attacking. They've got the girl. They've got the girl hostage." Marshal Thorne looked at the cabin. He saw Hannah standing up slowly, dust covering her dress, blood trickling down her face. She wasn't being held. She was holding the boy's hand, pulling him behind her. "Hannah Vance," Thorne barked. "Is that true? Are you being held?" "He's lying, Marshal." Hannah's voice was hoarse but steady. She walked to the edge of the porch, stepping over the broken wood. "Holt and Pike tried to kill this boy. They chased him into the flood. I pulled him out. And tonight, they came here to burn my house down to cover their tracks." "She's hysterical," Holt screamed, sweat pouring down his face. "Look at them, Marshal. Look at the ridge. That's a war party. If we don't start shooting, we're all dead men." Thorne looked up at the ridge. The chief, Ashkey's father, sat motionless on his war pony. He hadn't fired back at Pike. He was waiting. Then the chief raised his hand. The warriors lowered their bows. "What are they doing?" Pike stammered, backing away. "It's a trick." The chief spoke something in Navajo, his voice deep and carrying. Suddenly, the warriors dismounted. All of them. They handed their weapons to the younger men holding the horses. Then, they began to walk down the slope. They didn't walk toward Holt. They didn't walk toward the marshal. They walked toward the cabin. "They're rushing the house!" a deputy shouted, reaching for his Winchester. "No," Hannah said, watching them. "Wait." The warriors moved with a fluid, eerie grace. They ignored the white men entirely. They walked past the trembling horses of the posse. They walked past the cowering gunmen. They formed a circle around the cabin. A perfect tight circle, facing outward. Their backs were to Hannah and Ashkey. They were facing Holt and the marshal. They linked arms. And then the song began again. It wasn't the heavy, thumping chant of before. This was different. It was a high, harmonic hum that started in the chest and rose to the sky. It was a melody that felt like cool water on a burn. Ashkey tugged on Hannah's sleeve. "It is the Sin Bealitzo," he whispered. "The song of the Iron Shield. It is sung for a warrior who has saved the blood of the people." Hannah realized with a jolt that brought tears to her eyes. They weren't besieging her. They were guarding her. The Navajo warriors had turned themselves into a human wall between Hannah and the men who wanted to hurt her. They were telling the marshal, without speaking a word of English, that to get to the girl, he would have to kill every single one of them. Marshal Thorne sat on his horse, stunned. He had fought in the Indian Wars. He had seen battles. He had never seen this. He looked at Holt. "You said they were attacking her." Holt was pale, his bravado crumbling. They've bewitched her. It's a trick." Thorne looked at the scorched logs of the cabin. He looked at the bullet holes in the door. He looked at the pile of dry brush Pike had tried to light. Then he looked at Hannah, standing on the porch, protected by the very people the town called savages. "Get down off your horse, Holt," Thorne said quietly. "What?" Holt blinked. I said get down. Thorne unholstered his revolver, but he didn't aim it at the ridge. He aimed it at the rancher. You too, Pike, and the rest of you hired guns. Drop the belts. You can't be serious, Holt sputtered. You're taking the word of a girl and a bunch of Indians over the owner of the Double Bar H? I'm taking the evidence of my eyes, Thorne said. I see a cabin full of bullet holes. I see a girl bleeding. And I see a tribe of warriors acting with more honor than you've shown in your whole life. This is a mistake, Pike snarled, his hand twitching toward his holster. Try it, Silas, Thorne said coldly. Please, give me a reason. Pike hesitated, looked at the wall of Navajo warriors, then at the marshal's gun. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop to the dust. One by one, Holt's men disarmed. The singing continued, rising in volume, a beautiful, haunting sound that seemed to cleanse the valley of the violence that had stained it. The chief walked through the line of warriors. He stepped onto the porch. He was a towering man, his face lined with years of sun and wind. He stopped in front of Hannah. He didn't bow. He looked her in the eye, equal to equal. He placed a hand on Ashki's shoulder. Then he took something from his own neck. It was a heavy silver medallion, inlaid with turquoise and coral. He placed it over Hannah's head. Ahehi, he said. Thank you. He is a good boy, Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. He is alive, the chief said, in perfect English, because you possess the spirit of the bear. You fought the water. You fought the fire. You fought the wolves. He turned to the marshal. Take your criminals, lawman. We will go in peace. But know this. This woman, Hannah Vance, is Diné family now. Her land is our land. Her enemies are our enemies. He looked at Holt, who was being handcuffed by a deputy. The chief's eyes were hard as flint. If you touch her again, the chief said softly, the song will change, and you will not like the next one. The sun rose on a changed world. The events of the night of the song spread through the territory faster than a prairie fire. By noon the next day, the town of Silver Creek was buzzing. Marshal Thorne didn't take Holt to the jail. He knew Holt's lawyers would have him out in an hour. He took him to the circuit courthouse in Flagstaff, where Judge Ambrose Halloway was sitting. Judge Halloway was a man known as the Hammer. He was a crippled Civil War veteran who hated two things: bullies and liars. 3 days later, the hearing began. It wasn't a criminal trial yet. It was a preliminary hearing for land rights and assault charges. But the whole town crowded into the stifling courtroom. Hannah sat in the front row. She wore her best dress, though it was frayed at the cuffs. Around her neck, she wore the chief's heavy silver medallion. It was a statement. She wasn't hiding her alliance. Jedediah Holt sat at the defense table, his hand bandaged, his expensive suit looking out of place in the dusty room. He looked confident. He had brought a lawyer from Phoenix, a slick man with a briefcase full of papers. Your Honor, the lawyer began, standing up and hooking his thumbs in his vest. This is a farce. Mr. Holt was acting in the defense of the community. He went to the Vance cabin to rescue a kidnapped child. The girl, Miss Vance, was clearly suffering from hysteria and fired upon peaceful citizens. Judge Halloway adjusted his spectacles. Peaceful citizens who were carrying torches and kerosene? Precautionary measures, Your Honor, the lawyer said smoothly. To clear brush. Fire prevention. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. And the boy? The judge asked. Where is the kidnapped boy? The savages took him back, the lawyer said dismissively. likely to be indoctrinated against honest white settlers. "Call your witness," the judge said to the prosecutor. Hannah stood up. She walked to the stand. She didn't look at Holt. She looked at the jury. 12 men from the town. Shopkeepers, blacksmiths, farmers. Men who had owed money to Holt. Men who had been bullied by Pike. She told the story. She told it simply. The flood. The red tunic in the water. The rope. The cold. The threats. "He didn't want to save the boy," Hannah said, her voice ringing clear in the silent room. "He called him a savage. He told Pike to finish it. He wanted the Navajo to attack so he could call the cavalry to wipe them out and take their grazing land. He wanted a war, and he was willing to kill me and a 7-year-old child to start it." "Objection," Holt's lawyer shouted. "Speculation. The witness cannot know Mr. Holt's mind." "I know what I saw," Hannah snapped, "and I know what I heard." "You are a confused young woman," the lawyer said, stepping close to the stand, trying to intimidate her. "Living alone, destitute, desperate for attention. Isn't it true, Miss Vance, that you owe Mr. Holt money? That you staged this whole thing to extort him?" The crowd murmured. It was a low blow. "I owe him nothing," Hannah said. "We have the ledgers." The lawyer waved a piece of paper. "Your father died in debt." "That debt was paid." A deep voice boomed from the back of the room. The doors of the courtroom swung open. Marshal Thorne stood there, and walking beside him was a man the townspeople recognized with a gasp. It was Arthur Sterling, the grand banker from Tucson. Sterling walked up the aisle, carrying a heavy leather book. He ignored Holt, who had suddenly turned the color of old milk. "Mr. Sterling?" the judge asked. "To what do we owe this honor?" "I heard about this case, Judge," Sterling said, placing the book on the bench. "And I decided to check the territorial records myself." He opened the book. "Jedediah Holt has been collecting interest on the Vance farm for 3 years," Sterling said, his voice dry and precise. "But according to the original deed and the bank records, Elias Vance paid off his mortgage in full 2 weeks before he died." The courtroom exploded. "Order!" The judge banged his gavel. "Explain yourself, Mr. Sterling." "Holt cooked the books," Sterling said, pointing a finger at the rancher. "He's been falsifying debt records for half the valley. He's been foreclosing on land that was already paid for, including Miss Vance's." Hannah stared at Holt. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a thief. He had been terrorizing her for a debt that didn't exist. Holt jumped up. "This is a lie. That banker is drunk." "Sit down, Mr. Holt," Judge Holloway roared, "or I will have you gagged." The judge turned to Hannah. "Miss Vance, is this true?" I didn't know," Hannah stammered. "I just paid what he told me to pay." "Then you have been robbed, young lady," the judge said grimly. He looked at Holt with a gaze that could peel paint. "Mr. Holt, it seems your empire is built on sand, and the tide just came in." But the final blow hadn't landed yet. Marshal Thorne stepped forward again. "Your Honor, there is one more witness." "Who?" Thorne opened the side door of the courtroom. Ashkey walked in. He was dressed in clean buckskins, holding the hand of his father, the chief. The courtroom went dead silent. Indians were rarely allowed in town, let alone a courtroom. The chief stopped at the bar. He nudged Ashkey forward. The boy looked at the judge. He looked at Holt. He pointed a small brown finger at the rancher. "He watched me," Ashkey said. His voice was small, but in the silence, it was deafening. "I was in the water. I screamed. He looked at me. He laughed. And then he rode away." The truth of a child is a hard thing to break. There was no malice in his voice, only a confusing sadness. He laughed? The judge asked gently. Yes, Ashke said. He laughed. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair. He looked at the jury. The 12 men were looking at Holt not with fear anymore, but with disgust. The spell of Holt's power was broken. I've heard enough for a preliminary, Judge Holloway said. Marshal, take Mr. Holt into custody, no bail. Charge him with fraud, extortion, and 2 counts of attempted murder. You can't do this to me, Holt screamed as the deputies grabbed his arms. I own this town. I am this town. Not anymore, Hannah said quietly from the stand. As they dragged Holt out, kicking and cursing, the crowd didn't cheer. They stood up. One by one, the people of Silver Creek stood up as Hannah Vance walked down the aisle. She wasn't just the girl at the edge of town anymore. She was the woman who had broken the tyrant's back. She stopped at the chief. He nodded to her. The song was heard, he said. Yes, Hannah smiled, touching the medallion. It was. But as she walked out into the sunlight, Hannah knew the story wasn't quite over. Holt was gone, but the land remained, and she had a future to build. The downfall of Jedediah Holt was not swift, and it was not merciful. It was a slow, grinding disintegration that mirrored the very drought he had tried to weaponize against his neighbors. After the trial, Holt was shackled in iron and placed on a prison train bound for Yuma. The Yuma Territorial Prison was known as the Hellhole of the West, a fortress carved out of granite on the banks of the Colorado River, where the temperature in the cells frequently rose above 110 degrees. For a man like Holt, who had spent his life insulated by silk sheets and the power of his checkbook, the reality of the stone cell was a shock his mind couldn't process. News drifted back to Silver Creek in fragments over the next few years. They said Holt tried to buy the guards, but his assets had been frozen by the courts. They said he tried to bully the other inmates, but without his hired guns, he was nothing more than a soft, aging man in a cage of wolves. He withered away, stripped of his vanity and his name, eventually becoming just another number on the infirmary roster. 3 years into his 20-year sentence, Jedediah Holt died of a fever, raving about floodwaters that weren't there. He was buried in the prison cemetery, his grave marked only by a wooden slat that the desert wind scoured blank within a season. The empire of the double bar H was auctioned off acre by acre, returning the valley to the families who had originally settled it. But while Holt's world was turning to dust, Hannah Vance's world was beginning to bloom. The winter immediately following the night of the song was brutal. The blizzard of 1888 struck the territory with a ferocity that froze cattle where they stood and buried cabins to the roofline. Hannah, still recovering from the financial ruin her father had left behind and the costs of the trial, faced the season with a grim determination. Her larder was half empty, her woodpile was low, and the icy wind whistled through the bullet holes in her cabin walls, scars from the siege that she hadn't yet had the time to repair. It was in the deepest part of January, when the drifts were 4 feet high, that the ghost of the canyon appeared. Hannah woke one morning to a silence so profound it felt heavy. She wrapped herself in a quilt and opened the heavy oak door, expecting to see nothing but white desolation. Instead, she stopped, her breath catching in the frozen air. Stacked neatly on her porch was a cord of seasoned juniper wood, enough to burn hot for a month. Beside it lay the carcass of a fresh buck, dressed and cleaned, wrapped in burlap. There were no footprints in the snow. The wind had already covered the tracks, but Hannah saw a single identifying mark. Tied to the antlers of the buck was a strip of red cloth. It was the same fabric from the tunic Ashki had worn in the flood. It wasn't charity. It was a tithe. It was a family looking after its own. The Navajo, confined to the reservation and often struggling themselves, had not forgotten the woman who stood between the bullet and the boy. This silent exchange continued for years. When the spring floods threatened the lower pasture, Hannah woke to find a new levee built of stones, constructed in the night by unseen hands. When her fence line was cut by drifting drifters, she would ride out to fix it, only to find the wire already spliced and taut. The people of Silver Creek watched this with a mixture of awe and confusion. They had spent decades fearing the shadows in the hills, but Hannah Vance walked among them. With the reparations money awarded to her by the court from Holt's liquidated estate, Hannah could have moved to St. Louis or San Francisco. She could have bought a fine house with gas lamps and servants. Instead, she bought lumber. She hired a crew from town, and she sent word to the reservation. She wanted to build a school. It was a radical idea in the Arizona Territory. At the time, the government's idea of education for the tribes was forced assimilation, taking children away, cutting their hair, and forbidding their language. Hannah wanted something different. She built a structure of red brick and white timber on the edge of her property, right where the creek met the canyon road. She called it the Two Rivers School. It wasn't easy. There were men in town who spat on the ground when she walked by, calling her an Indian lover. There were threats, shattered windows, and times when she sat on the porch of the half-finished schoolhouse with her Winchester across her lap, guarding the bricks just as she had guarded the boy. But Hannah possessed a stubbornness that was harder than the Arizona bedrock. The school opened in the autumn of 1890. The first class consisted of 12 children from the town and 8 children from the reservation. Among them, sitting in the front row with a slate board in his lap, was Ashki. He was 10 years old now, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He became the bridge. When the white children were afraid, Ashki made them laugh with trickster stories from his grandfather. When the Navajo children struggled with English, Ashki translated the lessons, weaving the two languages together until the playground sounded like a new dialect entirely. Hannah watched him grow, not as a mother, but as a guardian and a friend. She saw him turn into a young man of striking presence. He left for a few years to study law in the East, sponsored by the funds Hannah had set aside. But he returned to the territory with a suit in his saddlebag and the turquoise raven still around his neck. He didn't use his education to leave his people. He used it to fight for them. Ashki became a voice in the territorial legislature, a diplomat who stopped land grabs before they started, using the law as his weapon instead of the bow. Decades rolled by like the clouds over the Vermilion Cliffs. The turn of the century brought telephone lines, automobiles, and a paved road that bypassed the old canyon trail. The Vance cabin, once a lonely outpost, became a landmark. The bullet holes in the door were never patched over. They were varnished, preserved as a testament to the night the valley changed. Hannah Vance never married. The town gossip said she was too hard, too independent, or that she had given her heart to the land itself. But those who knew her saw the truth. Her family was vast. It was the hundreds of students who had passed through her schoolhouse. It was the tribe that called her Dine's sister. It was the peace she had carved out of the violence. In the winter of 1923, the end came. Hannah was 74 years old. Her lungs, weakened by a bout of pneumonia, finally began to fail. She lay in the iron bed in the corner of the cabin, the quilt pulled up to her chin. The room was warm, lit by the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. The doctor from Flagstaff had come and gone, leaving only morphine and a sympathetic shake of his head. "It's a matter of hours," he had told the weeping nurse. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes. And then the sound began. It started low, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Thump, thump, thump. The nurse looked up, startled. "Is that thunder?" Hannah opened her eyes. They were milky with age, but they sparked with sudden recognition. "No," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Open the door." "Miss Vance, it's freezing out there." "Open the door," Hannah commanded, with a flash of the steel that had stared down Silas Pike. The nurse hesitated, then unlatched the heavy door and swung it wide. The yard of the Vance ranch was full. It wasn't just a few riders. It seemed as though the entire history of the valley had gathered in the twilight. There were Ford Model T cars parked next to weather-beaten wagons. There were young men in denim and old men in buckskin. There were women holding babies wrapped in Pendleton blankets. Hundreds of Navajo had come down from the high country. They stood in the snow, their breath rising in silver plumes. Standing at the front of the crowd, hat in hand, was Ashki. His hair was streaked with gray now, his face lined with the weight of his responsibilities. But he stood tall. He stepped onto the porch and walked into the room. He knelt by the bed, taking Hannah's frail hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, the grip of the boy she had pulled from the floodwater, grown strong. "You shouldn't be out in the cold," Hannah whispered, smiling weakly. "We are not cold," Ashki said softly. "We are here to walk you home." He turned his head toward the open door and nodded once. Outside, the drumbeat changed. It wasn't the war song of the Sinbe Alitso, the shield song that they had sung 50 years ago. This was softer, more melodic. It was the Hozuji, the blessing way, but sung with a cadence of farewell. It was a song that spoke of beauty before you, beauty behind you, beauty above you, and beauty below you. The sound filled the small cabin, pushing back the shadows. It was a chorus of hundreds of voices, singing not for a stranger, not for a white woman, but for a matriarch of the tribe. Tears slipped down the nurse's face as she watched. She realized she was witnessing something that would never happen again, the passing of an era. Hannah looked at Ashki. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and touched the silver raven that hung around his neck. "You kept it," she said. "It was never mine," Ashki replied. "It belongs to the one who carries the spirit." He unclasped the heavy necklace and gently placed it around Hannah's neck. The silver felt cool against her fevered skin. "The water is rising, Ashki," she murmured, her mind drifting back to that day in the canyon. "Hold on." Ashki squeezed her hand. "I have you, Hannah. I have you. You can let go of the rope now. You are safe." Hannah Vance closed her eyes. She listened to the drumbeat, steady and strong, like the heartbeat of the land she'd fought for. She didn't hear the wind anymore. She didn't feel the pain. She only felt the rhythm of the song carrying her up, out of the canyon, toward the high ground. The singing continued long after her breathing stopped. It continued until the moon rose high and white over the Badlands, a vigil of gratitude that echoed off the canyon walls. They buried her the next day on the ridge overlooking the devil's throat. It was the very spot where she had anchored the rope. Ashki himself carved the headstone from red sandstone. He didn't put a Bible verse or a generic epitaph. He carved the name the tribe had given her, Hana Vance, Dine Bisodizin, the prayer of the people. The cabin is gone now, reclaimed by the earth and the flash floods of 100 summers. The schoolhouse is a ruin of red brick, covered in ivy, but the legend remains. Travelers who camp near the wash say that on quiet nights, when the air is thick with the smell of sage and ozone, you can hear it. Not the wind, not the coyotes, but a faint, rhythmic humming. It is the sound of a song that never ended, guarding the valley where a girl with a rifle and a heart of iron taught the world that blood is thicker than water, but spirit is stronger than both. And that is the incredible true legend of Hana Vance. In a time when the West was wild and ruled by the gun, she proved that courage isn't about how many men you can kill. It's about who you are willing to save. She stood her ground against the tyrant, not with hate, but with humanity. And in doing so, she turned a war into a brotherhood. It makes you wonder, how many other stories like this are buried under the dust of history, waiting for us to find them? If this story moved you, or if you think Hana's bravery deserves to be remembered, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe my channel.